these and more. And I think it's, and the Shakopee Heritage Society does have a newsletter. We do have, like I said, the brochures, and we have programs ongoing. If you're interested in joining, it's $20, and you get the newsletter 4 times a year. You get brochures, you get 96 a year, and we have other things too. And some of the lists of things that are coming up are also on one of the papers that's over there, just so you know. Okay, so today we're calling A Place for Women, the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee. And as we start, we always acknowledge here that this land here that we're on is the land of the Dakota people. So we want to honor the gratitude of the land itself, the people who have stewarded it through the ages, including the Ojibwa and other indigenous nations. All right. So we start, and I was looking in the library here upstairs. They used to have, I think they still do, a newsletter that the women's reformatory, as we used to call it, they used to have a thing would have newsletter, and people would have different quotes. And this one I really like. This is one of the residents, I guess, of the place, and she said, "We are not saints. We are just a bunch of hurting, broken people looking for a way to put the pieces of our lives back together again." And I think it's a really good way to think about it in general. Now, when we talk about the women's reformatory, we have to think a lot about this particular person who is not even from here, okay? Isabel Davis Higby. She was born in 1849 and died in 1915. It's a nice picture of her. I have another picture for that. She looks even better. But she was born in Vermont, okay? And she became a school teacher when she was 14 years old. Just weird by that, but anyway, that's the thing. And then she moved to Minneapolis in 1870, and she taught here. You can just grab your stuff here if you want, and just go. And then she married, and this is the part that if you were a smart person, you marry someone like Chester G. Higby. They married in January of 1876. Why? Chester had a lot of money. And if you're going to marry, you might as well get one who had some money. And so she didn't work afterwards, but she did a lot of volunteer work because she had the money to do so, which was really nice. And Isabel really spoke a lot about the needs of the women and the children, the poor and the downtrodden. She said there was a time when individual efforts was sufficient to meet social needs, but life was growing too complex that organization is absolutely necessary. And so with her help, in 1908, they started the construction of a separate school for delinquent girls, which is called Minnesota Home Schools for Girls in Sauk Center, Minnesota. Okay. But then for 20 years, she and others tried to get a place for women who are convicted of crimes, but the lawmakers did not support it. And that's actually a picture right there. She's looking pretty good, don't you think? Anyway, that's what money does. Okay. Botox and everything, whatever. But anyway. So anyway, what we do know is that on March 4th, 1915, Isabel, with 50 other women, went to the Capitol, and she decided that Isabel was going to testify in the meeting. It's also interesting that on that same day, a bill to allow women to vote was turned down again. So this has happened over and over again. So in other words, they were able to testify that they couldn't vote. In fact, it would be another 5 years before the women got the right to vote. And at that time, it was only if you were white also, okay? But Isabel was not happy, and so she had a plan. She stood and faced the men, who were the only ones who were allowed to vote, and told them that they should have a women's reformatory. There was no place in Minnesota for women in trouble. She faced the men in the committee room, really across the privilege of custom law that created, and she spoke. She said that women at that time, some women, if they were in trouble, they would put them in Stillwater prison, which is in a small little area, okay? And most of them would actually have to work for the wardens. That's like helpers or whatever. It's kind of what they did, okay? So this picture is kind of interesting because it shows just a little group of them there, okay? Now that Stillwater prison is going to be closed pretty soon, it sounds like, okay? But she said, Isabel said, women need to have a place to provide a humane and healthy environment that could help them return to society as contributing members. And she said, we must give the women fresh air, God's glorious sunshine, and as much freedom as is consistent with discipline. I shall trust your judgment to accord us a woman's reformatory. Okay? And then she went and sat down. She started coughing. She fell back in her chair. She lost consciousness. It was 9:15 p.m. Snow began to fall. A doctor was called, and Isabel, who had just spoken, had died. So because of that, in the newspaper the next day, you can imagine what it said. They're like, why aren't they doing this? She's been working so hard, so that really helped. In fact, that's so good for her. One person said, no man can refuse us the reformatory when they realize that the women are willing to give up their lives for it. And the legislators finally responded. So that's just kind of an interesting thing. And so they look around, there's a lot of information about different places they were looking for where the reformatory could be. And it turns out that they picked 167 acres of land at the edge of Shakopee. Now I say the edge of Shakopee because it's really in the middle of Shakopee right now. But at that time it was at the edge of Shakopee, okay? And the women's reformatory began in Shakopee in 1920. And there's the first building. And that was offices and things like that, mostly there. And it's called Isabel Higby Hall. And you know why? You should know now, right? Okay. So the building is named in grateful appreciation of the lives and labor of Mrs. Isabel Higby, who died March 4th, 1915, in the state capitol in St. Paul after pleading for the establishment of this institution. So that sign is there. Now, that building is not there anymore. In fact, that whole place moved across the road. But they also just have a new building that has that too, so that's good to know. So they ended up having several cottages in the area. And this would be like on 6th Street. I think I have it. I'm trying to think what this other road is there. Adams Street, that would be, yeah, essentially. Okay, so one of them was named the Shaw Cottage. That was built in 1920 after Anna Howard Shaw. And she was a leader of the suffrage movement in the United States. She was also a physician, and she was also the first ordained woman Methodist ministers in the United States. Geez, she's busy. Okay. So that's this Shaw Cottage, and we'll talk more about that one later. And then in 1922, they added the Sanford Cottage. That was Maria Sanford. She was an American educator. And then they had the Susan B. Anthony Cottage in 1925. And that was, you know, who Susan B. Anthony is. I hope you would know by now, okay? She was born in a Quaker family, but she was really focused on social equality. And she also was involved with the anti-slavery petition when she was 17 years old. And so if you look at the place itself, these are the 4 cottages that were set up, and then this is what it would be. I gotta look into it.
Do they take that plaque and put it over on the new building?
Yeah, yes. This is actually 6th Avenue, I believe. In Shakopee. So the first superintendent who started this was Florence Manahan. She was there from 1919 to 1932, which is kind of a long time, but that actually helped a lot with what it's doing. And on February 2nd, 1920, the first 4 women from Stillwater arrived here in Shakopee, okay? And here they were. First was Marie. Marie had murdered her husband, and she was a cook. And then Old Rose, and those poor thing got called Old Rose. But anyway, actually, okay, I should mention one thing. We used to drive by the prison all the time, and I was telling my mom, I said, "You're going there." You're going. But anyway, I just remember that about when I see Old Rose. Okay, she was addicted to dope and drink, and she became the seamstress. And then Addie was a prostitute, a shoplifter, and drug addict. And she became the scrub woman and the housekeeper. And then Frances was a shoplifter, a prostitute, and she became a waitress. So those 4 were there, and then they slowly would move around each time, and so they get all of the experience of all of these. They worked 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. They were taught all processes of housekeeping. Some also worked at the farm that was here, taking care of the chickens, pigs, milking the cows, shocking grain, weeding asparagus, picking vegetables and fruit, including strawberries and gooseberries. And so here, give us just a picture of what it was. I do like this because I also think it's really fun when you look at this is like a postcard, you know, that's available. But what's really interesting, look, they spelled Shakopee there. It's like, obviously, no one is proofers. I just laugh when I ever see that. But anyway, in 1927, they had about 20 firms were bidding to bid on a farm at the State Reformatory. And Gallagher was the person who built the farm for $414. Okay, this was in 1921. And the person who then worked there on that farm for all the way through until the very end of that farming part was Nick Phelan. Phelan, I think it's actually. That's his picture. And I asked Barbara Greening, who's a member of the Shakopee Heritage Society, I was asking about that. And she said, my father's brother, Wallace, was married to Nick's daughter, Marie. The barn was a whole farm, with a farmhouse and so on, that they ran for the state as a rehab project for the Women's Reformatory across the street. And she also said, my family reaped the benefits of products on rare occasions. Marie, the daughter, never had children though. So eventually it was end when Nick became too old to run the place. Okay. But there's nice pictures in 1927 of the people working on the farm. And I think, you know, it was a great way for a lot of people to learn things that they hadn't even think about, that hadn't ever done, I think, before. And I'm sure it was a lot of work. But also, of course, because they're here, which is now, the area that they're here now is Sweeney Elementary School is part of this, right? Which is elementary school. But anyway, they were working here. Of course, some of them would escape every so often. Okay? And we'll talk about it a little bit, I think. But it is interesting because in these pictures, they actually show the people's faces. Others show no faces, you know, so you won't know who the person is. Although later people, like now this picture, they'll show faces too. But they did a lot of work. They said that 21 people lived in each cottage. And there's a sewing room there for everyone. They made dresses, coats, underwear, and everything used by the place. Smart, really. They also said they sewed for other places, including 906 dresses, 134 winter coats, 972 boys' underwear, 240 pairs of bloomers. You know what bloomers are, right? Some of you may remember, probably not participated. 564 nightgowns, 48 working shirts, and 12 baby bonnets, which they gave to the Owatonna State School. So there's also, just for the hospital for the insane, which is unbearable, they also did shirts, nightshirts, union suits, and nightgowns. So all that happened within the first 15 months of having the reformatory. It was noted in 1928, 22nd, I should say. I just think that's, they did a lot of work, you know, really. Which, you know, hopefully that was a good thing. So here with the buildings here. And one of the persons here from Shakopee, Cheryl Ryan, said she remembered the Girl Scouts we visited, and we had a Christmas party for them. We brought cookies and other gifts we made. We sang songs for them. And a lot of people growing up remember having that as an experience for a lot of people. And I think it was kind of a good way to learn a little bit about other people too. Now, Don Emerson Schultz, he was a maintenance man for the place for 37 years. And he was really an interesting experience, actually. He married Elizabeth Abel, I think it is. They had the bar in town, okay? Married in St. Mark's Church. They had 6 children. And he said, Don said, I worked for the Women's State Reformatory. I started out on the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., making the grounds outside of the building, watching for fires, broken windows, and escapes. I had a good luck on the shift. Only found 1 man on grounds and 3 boys another time. So I'm guessing that's part of the problem, that they watch more than anything. And of course, there's no fence there, right? So it didn't help. Well, help or don't help, depending on what. He's also mentioned, he says, in the time, I had to move to the afternoon shift, and the state didn't pay much at that time. You remember that? I'm sure it's a common thing too. And this is him with his first 5 kids, I guess. Donald's with his son Donald, Kathleen, then Monica, Anita, and Mary. And many of those are still around. Some here, some in the area, some are in Florida now, but they all have tie-ins to this area so much. And Mary at one point said, she said, my dad worked in the state reformatory for many years and retired from them as well. My dad was such a good man and treated the women with respect. And in fact, that when he had a retirement party, they had so many people talking about how much impact it was to have him there. He fixed everything. That was the big thing. But he also was just a good person. In fact, one of the kids said, I had to make a confession. Many years ago when I was at 4-H, I would say when I was about 14 years old or so, I was in the process of making a dress to be entered in the state fair. I ran into a snag and one of the inmates finished my dress. Now she admits that, the whole thing is kind of funny, but then she says, what a nice thing to do. She said she didn't have to, but she wanted to, and she did an exemplary, a wonderful job on it too. She said she remembered that she was questioned about the details of the workmanship. She said she knew clearly that they knew that this was not something that she learned as a 4-H member. But she said, this is Mary, she said, I must say that I had never forgot her or her kindness. I don't remember what her looked like or what her name is, but I still remember her. And of course, the family lived very close to the reformatory, so that helped also, I think. So here they are with one, house 6 of them. Mary also said, I remember my brothers and sisters on the reformatory on Halloween, and we dressed as Grandma and Grandpa's clothes. We would songs for the women housed in each houses. Most of them had children of their own. It put a smile on their face, if only for a short time. And Donald began talking about this. He said, I had very few runaways, but some of the girls would let me know ahead of time if something was going to happen, or I could watch for it. So, he was enough connection with them that they would actually let him know when someone's going to run away and get him before, And this is actually right before he died, actually, this picture of Donald with Elizabeth. In 1920, when the place was open, they had 7,000 for all of the furniture. That's really not that much in that time. But if you look at the stuff, this is the thing. This would sell very well now. I think it's called mission furniture, I think is what they call it now, but anyway. And there you see them working on the sewing area. Is with where the A's at, where they sit at. You see again with their heads turned so they couldn't see exactly who the person was. They said there were no guns, no guard towers, or prison walls. Nevertheless, Florence observed, one thing that made the place a prison, all must rise, rest, eat, sleep, study, work, play, retire at someone else's will. And then, of course, eventually other people became the superintendents at that time, Ruth, Estelle, and Clara. Then we bring up this other person. And this one ties in, if you're a member of the Scott County Historical Society, their newsletter actually talks about this person. Actually, it's not him so much, but sorry, I have my stroke, so sometimes I can't get the word wrong, but this is Frank's wife. But Frank here was born in 1892 and died in 1925. He was born in Sleepy Eye. His parents were Peter and Amelia. There's pictures of them here. The father was a retail grocery real estate agent and postmaster, I should say, and a farmer. They had 10 children. And Frank, the one we saw the picture at the beginning, was the 8th child, and a twin was at the same time, okay? There's an article that's from the newsletter that you can get online, the Scott County Historical Society by Lindsay Marshall, who's here, okay? In there, she talked about the time when Frank's wife killed Frank, okay? Now Frank was in military training, okay? After that, he was in England also. He flew for a long time, and then returned to the Midwest. In 1922, he joined his brother Peter, they're twins of course, in Minneapolis, okay? On January 1st, 1924, Frank married Evelyn Maloney in Minneapolis. There's a picture of them. They said Frank worked for a short time in Michigan before returning to Minnesota. Just FYI. 2020 vision for that, okay? Because this is what was in the newsletter. So you're like, oh my God, what fun, right? And it was kind of fun. It's a great article because she went and found out a lot of information. Okay, this is her picture of her here at the, this was at the reformatory, I think. The night before, Frank and Evelyn were drinking with a few friends at the apartment. It was close to the blocks where the US Bank Stadium sit today. They said, some people say that several neighbors heard a fight happening. There was loud voices, cursing, things being thrown, and then I'll finish with a loud thud. According to Linda, in an article, Lindsay, I should say, it said police arrived at the apartment to find a bloody stained bread knife on the windowsill and Frank lying dead in the kitchen. So she was charged with murder of the first degree and was taken in by the police. The jury is kind of interesting because at this time, there were actually equal number of men and women in the jury. There were 6 and 6, which is really interesting. Because it's also really interesting, well, of course, they had to be Caucasian, right? But also, they had to, there only was 3 years earlier when they actually allowed women to even be in the jury. It's just amazing, this time period is just quite interesting. So, Evelyn thought, well, this is great, there's 6 women, 6 men, so probably they're gonna pick, she'll get it, she'll be okay. So that's what she thought. But it took 3 hours and 25 minutes and they decided it was murder of the 3rd degree. So Evelyn was sentenced to a term of no less than 7 and no more than 30 years at the Women's Reformatory. So it's kind of interesting just because I always wondered, killing somebody, you don't think that they're going to end up being here in Shakopee, but apparently, yeah. Happened more often than you think, okay? Anyway, she was there. It's interesting, in the 1930 census, it showed her on the list, for the census here, and it says she was, her occupation there was a seamstress. And by 1940, there was no information about her. She was gone from there. So she was there, but not all that long, I think, all things considered. And that's all we really know about her at this point. We couldn't find much more. But I just think it's kind of an interesting article about a person who was here. Now this is another one. This is in 1933, and this is Ruth Gardner, maybe. Her name was Ruth Gardner, or Laura Jensen, or Ruth Rednick, or Ruth Warner. Okay, those are all names she used many times for several different things. She said she escaped from the Women's Reformatory on February 20th, 1933. She was 22 years old, 5'6" and 5'8", and 109 pounds. It's just kind of interesting. This was actually, there was a thing that you put in the post office, you know what I'm saying? So I have that of her, and this is what it says about her. Okay. She was a clever forger. She operated in Ohio, Michigan, and Minnesota. She would always present her victims with a letter from an insurance company, and they usually asked for money, usually about $70. And it says, on the poster it says, if you find Ruth, bring her to the office of the Minnesota State Reformatory for Women in Shakopee. You will get a $25 reward. I can't remember if I was trying to find out whether she ever ended up back here or not. I don't think I've ever seen. But it's just kind of interesting in terms of stuff that you find, okay? Again, Kathy Jefferson said, every now and then the ladies, the inmates, would play softball. They formed a team and would play ball with some of the Shakopee ladies' team. My uncle was an umpire. When the inmates would run for the bases, the Shakopee team pretty much moved out of the way and let them pass. One of the inmates told the second baseman that I killed my old man and I'll kill you too. He said, she said, I'm not sure I was kidding, but I'm not have taken the chance. And this is in 1948. He said that in August, it was 8 p.m., a woman escaped from the place. She was working in the fields. She made her way to Homeschool Bridge and crossed to the north side. So Street Bridge is still there as a walking path there, right? So you go across the river to the other side, okay? And then she started thumbing a ride, right? That was the concept, which is, a good idea, okay? So John Wormerskirchen pulled up, and the woman got into the car. As he drove, John asked her name, and she said, none of your business. What is your name? The driver answered short and sweet, don't be surprised, I'm the sheriff. The drive ended shortly after back in the uniform. So it's just fun when, and so of course that is in the newspaper because it's kind of a fun story too, but it's actually what's true, so. Now, one thing we talked about some of the things that we had at the place. The Shaw Cottage was there, became the Shakopee Home for Children from 1951 to 1969. Okay, 30 girls from age 4 to 12 lived in the cottage. 10 staff members would work there, along with 10 inmates. This is kind of the time before there was a law that said you have to have students who have disabilities, they should be able to go to school. At that time, they just put them in a home or do nothing, right? So here they had it at this place and people would do it. It was kind of a great idea, actually. Jerry Reagan and his family from the Scott County drugstore, which is on First Avenue, would come every day, every Sunday morning, with 2 buckets of Bridgman ice cream for the homes, the children at the home. And he always remembered that as a common thing that they would always do. And again, looking at the reflective newspaper that's about the people, Carla said, she said, when I go to work, it is like a dream come true. To someone, I am very, very important. It is not important to these retarded children that I committed a crime. It is important that I can wipe away tears and kiss a cut. That makes me feel very special, and that is how the home has helped me. So it became, we don't use the word retarded as a thing generally, but in terms of at the time, this was in 1964, it was obviously a time where there was a good connection that happened between the inmates and the people who had disabilities. Now continue on, here's another one of the stories. This is what they call 15 Minutes of Freedom. Bernice Prince was 27, made her way from the sewing room, went over the fence to freedom. Ruby Bridges, the superintendent, said it was like, seemed like they were going over the fence. There really wasn't a fence there, really. It was just shrubbery there. You could just jump over it. But anyway, she was caught by raw malting plant on West First Avenue by Shakopee and Scott County Police. So 15 minutes of citing, but they catch them, which they happen over and over again. Here's another one. This is these people who workers there. Lucille Felix usually locks the women in their rooms at 9 p.m. This was in 1967. Julius Schneider watched from behind a barred security door at the end of the corridor. The 6 inmates jumped Felix as one of the escapers threatened her with this sharp instrument. They overpowered Schroeder and took his car keys. They tied both workers with sheets. They left out the back door and fled with a male guard's auto. That must have been a big scary thing there. It's interesting because by the next night, they had all found out that they found the stolen auto. It was covered in North 6th Street and Plymouth Avenue in Minneapolis. And of course, the inmates were not there. So sometimes it works, just in case you ever have that need, okay? And here's another one. This was in 1967. 3 escaped. These people, they returned to Shakopee from Anoka State Hospital. She was reported missing. And then another person was allowed to make a shopping trip to downtown Shakopee, and she escapes. And then eventually the third one hung a sheet out the second store window after removing part of the window frame. And she had been caught with first-degree manslaughter. She escaped with a burlap sack containing other clothes on her as a getaway. So it would happen again and again. And each time it would happen, people in shock would be like, oh my God, we need to have a fence. And so they would ask to go to the city council to ask for a fence, and then it had to go to the next level to the state, and then it was always turned down. Because really, they almost always caught almost everyone that was there. Another thing that was done a lot was the Braille Project, and that was really an important thing. We did it for a short time, then we stopped and we did it again. The people training from the Library of Congress, they were certificates as volunteer Braille transcribers. They transcribed more than 35,000 pages of text, including 55 textbooks, including a whole big thing. So it's just an interesting project that people did there. They said that through the Braille Project, women inmates at Shakopee gained more than 20 years of service to blind people. So good, what a great thing that, if you're in prison, at least you're doing something good, right? And of course, the farm that we talked about before, but Nick was there. He was there for 37 years. He retired in 1957. When he retired, then they had that land. They sold a lot of it to the city of Shakopee, of Scott County, and also St. Mark's Cemetery. And so if you look at what is now the Catholic Cemetery on 10th Street, that used to be part of the farm, as well as Sweeney School. Those people, all that area used to be part of the thing, but now it's here. 36 acres of land were retained from the original farm to become the site of the new institution. And the institution was right across the street, okay? So on 6th Street, right across the street, was where the new building was done. Of course, we had new superintendents, Robert, which was the first male superintendents, and Jackie Fleming. There's Jackie there. Another thing that they worked on was the canine companions for independence. 7 puppies were trained. They actually taught the puppies how to help. And then they got a special award, and then after that, the program was shut down. So every time, and it was kind of what happens in the Congress in Minnesota, if they have money, and then they didn't have money, and, so then things went back and forth depending on that. Here's some other superintendents. There's 2 more other men, the others are women. And then again, the new state-of-the-art women's prison was adjacent to the old women's prison. It was opened in 1986. And of course, it changed its name. So remember, it was the Women's Reformatory. That's what we always called it, the Women's Reformatory. But actually, it's called the Minnesota Correctional Facility Shakopee, okay? Really, that was in 1979 when they switched that for all of the different prisons in Minnesota. It's a little bit of the thing. There's a farm there before it was gone. Okay. The old prison could hold up to 60 people, but it was 90 people before they moved across the street. Okay. The new prison in August of 1986 included 5 units for 132 people. How many people actually are there now? Anybody know? Yes. Good guess, but you're wrong. And I'm not going to tell you yet, but I will before you. Just remember here in terms of the amount, because it's going to be important later. Okay. So here's the new place. Again, there's no really fence. There's a little fence there, but not much. The names of the place of course, we had Higby, Anthony, Roosevelt, Tubman, and the Independent Learning Center. In 2000, they added 24 beds, okay? That was named after a doctor from Puerto Rico, the first woman and the first Hispanic Surgeon General. And it's also interesting, in 2009, they actually had the people who were inmates from the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee help prepare the Shakopee story, which of course we have this here. This is the same one, just reprinted, okay? And of course, these are available, by the way, but if you got this thing, I don't think it has this thing. If you have this on the back, there should be a star on the top. And if you have it, you will get this. You got some got it? No? That's because you didn't pick it up over there? I'll give it another thing a little bit later. But anyway, just so you know, hear them doing the Shakopee story, okay? Here's what it looked like inside, and this is still there, okay? Although I think the computer's a little different. But you know, it's pretty nice. It is pretty nice. There's 2 people in the room. They added the Margaret Mead Mental Health Unit opened in 1994. And then they did 2 other ones who opened in 1994. There were 45 bed units. Here it is, my thing. In 1930s and 40s, there's 40 people. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it grew. Today, 569. I just checked on that today to make sure. Isn't that interesting? See, the women are getting worse and worse. I really have no idea. I'm just saying that it's a good thing to say. All right. And of course, Florence again said, unless a woman is self-wished to change, no improvement can be made for her character. So again, they added more treatment places, and then they added a living unit, a place for group therapy, and a chemical dependency program, which was needed more and more. That's it. You just see this like that. It's also just interesting. I'm not going into this much, but this is just in terms of the people there who are there. Most of it is you think there, which is basically drugs. Okay, homicide is about 10%. Otherwise, it's like sex trafficking related, assaults, property crimes. So all those things are all a thing, but just kind of interesting to know. It's also interesting because this is, of course, in 2017, but this is in terms of the people who are here. The top one, the little small area, those are Asians. The next one is African Americans. The biggest one there is Native Americans, and then white. Okay. It's just interesting because of 569 women who are incarcerated in prison, 20% are Native American, even though Native Americans make only just 1% of Minnesota population. And so we talk about some of the people, and this is another one that's kind of interesting. This is in 1949, and it's Edna and Beulah, I think is how you say that, okay? She was Native American. And it's kind of an interesting story because the judge ordered the 25-year-old woman Edna to serve time for committed grand larceny because she was writing bad checks. It's not the worst thing in the world. Okay, but it was not her first time in prison. She had a separate time before then. She said she had attracted attention because she had boyish features and sexual relationship with other prisoners. And of course that would happen normally. But when she became in the second term in Shakopee, she met Beulah. She was a 21-year-old Ojibwa woman because she was there for stealing clothing, foods, and a ring. They escaped together 3 times in 2 years.
They weren't very good.
I feel like they were not so good, but at the same time, they sure kept trying. So, after the 3rd time of escape, okay, Edna attempted suicide but survived. The next morning, she tried again. Oops, sorry. She turned her frustrations to institution. She flooded the cell wall with the water from the toilet and used a mattress spring to break a window. So she transferred to St. Peter's State Hospital, and she had the ECT, the shock therapy there. I'm not sure that worked so great, but anyway. But again, when she was at St. Peter's, she came back, again, they escaped again. They disguised themselves in overalls and farm jackets. They snuck into the basement of the Sanford Cottage in 1949, broke open a nailed shut window and fled. They hitchhiked west looking for jobs. They introduced themselves as a married couple named Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Farrell. So the superintendent at that time wrote to 4 sheriffs in California, and she said, watch out, they're going to be there, she said, so watch out, okay? She said that Edna was an acquaintance of the colony of homosexuals in Los Angeles and likely would show up in the city. Instead, the 2 people went to Sacramento, where Vida was there, which is her sister. They got, from there, they got a car, and they went, for 3 months, they hitchhiked to Seattle, Washington, visited their parents. That's when they gave them the beautiful 1936 Plymouth Coupe. That's a nice car, they should have saved that one, but anyway. The women then moved to settle down, rent an apartment, open a bank account to pay their rent. Larrabee did a gas station, and Brunel sewed for a dress shop. By the late summer, they're traveling again to Minneapolis. When they got there, they also went to the Turtle Garden, Minnesota, I should say, Turtle Mountain Indian Reservation in North Dakota. The Minnesota Friends tipped off police, telling to look out for a black Plymouth Coupe. I'm guessing she was jealous. That's just mine. Okay. So they recognized they saw them in Sioux City, I should say. They seized them, returned to Shakopee. They had 8 months of freedom, but they were over, they were stuck. They said they actually escaped again. Now I just keep thinking, okay, wouldn't they figure this out, that it was a common thing? But anyway, but they were found, returned to prison within days. There were no other further attempts. In 1952, they were both paroled and started living lives apart. One was in Washington and the other was in Minnesota, and married a man named George Venny. And the only other thing that's interesting in the case file says, a note stated that in 1953, she left her husband in St. Paul, drove for more than 1,600 miles to Seattle, where she and Edna reunited. It is quite, I feel like that would be a good movie.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that they want, but it's kind of quite interesting. This is another person, she worked at the reformatory, Ty Dorshinigiga, I think is how it's pronounced. She was born in Orange, California. Her parents were born in Japan. When she was 6 years old, her father died. Her mother, who was a dressmaker, worked at home. She remarried. He was a deep sea fisherman. The parents were probably Buddhists, but they didn't mind because Ty said she joined the local Japanese Baptist church. Now remember the time period, okay? Japanese military accident started happening a lot. And so eventually they said that Japanese Americans would not be permitted to live on the coast. So the parents moved to Utah, and she herself went to a university. She thought it was safe enough to be a safe haven. But when the Pearl Harbor happened, they had a feeling that Japanese Americans would change forever. And so it ended up, she was at an internment camp in southwestern Arizona. It was the largest of 10 American concentration camps, okay? It's also interesting because the land that this was located on was actually part of the Colorado River Indian Reservation. And they complained and said, we don't want this building here, and they did it anyway, okay? They took over 71,000 acres of land and began building all these units like this. So of course, remember that our person, Ty, they didn't talk much about that, but she said, she remembers there's straw mattress, there's no privacy. She knew it was very temporary, but it wasn't very good because over time, it would get worse and worse. It was the same thing again and again, and more were coming. And so finally, to leave the camp, she decided she was allowed to attend university. So she spent the rest of her life defending the dignity of others. So she went to the University of Minnesota for a master's degree in social work. While she was there, she had to work at the women's prison here in Shakopee. Okay, she was training as staff for that place for several years, and for 25 years she served as an administration area, including supervising the Minnesota Women's Reformatory. Now, how is that tied in? Okay. In 1954, she's there. An inmate escaped by wiggling out of a basement window. You think they figure out what these window things to put some bars on, but anyway. Okay, so she's 20 years old. She'd gone to the basement to clean. It was 8 a.m. and she noted that the window in the basement was easy to open. She escaped. When she got to the end, when they noticed that, they contacted the Scott County authorities at 8:02 a.m. quickly. Meanwhile, Ty, who was the assistant superintendent, was driving on Highway 169 and Highway 5 when she saw the woman there going, thumbing the ride, right? And so she took her back to prison. And at the reformatory, the guards let the Scott County authorities know she's back in prison after only 10 minutes of freedom. I find it after a while, I feel sorry. I feel like, oh, just something. It's kind of fun when they get escaped. I'm like, come on, let's see what's going to happen. All right. Anyway, she ended up dying at 102 years old in 2024. This is the one I just laughed a lot. This is because this was a teen murderer. She was here in 1998. Smashing Pumpkin was in Minneapolis. Okay. You know what that is? It's a band. Weird band, but it was a band, right? She she knew she was serving for 12 years as second-degree murder. But she joined 1,000 fans to see the show at the Hennepin Avenue block party. She was removed, she found at midnight, and was put into the segregated unit here in Shakopee. And this person is just interesting. Lucille, when she was young, she was released from prison at age 93. Okay, I think she'd been there for 7 years, I think, there. She said, did it hurt, she asked. I really wanted to hurt you because you hurt me so deeply and it was so good for you. She was, at that time, she was 88 years old. She shot this other person, Steve. Okay? When she got here to Shakopee, the inmates called her grandma. Because she was 88 when she got out. When she got out of prison at age 93. And what I like is that the first thing that she wanted to do was go to Perkins, downtown Shakopee. Okay? She said she was the oldest member of the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee. She ended up dying in Minneapolis, or the area around Minneapolis, I think when she was 93. So, but anyways, kind of there is when she's leaving her prison, the prison. And this one is kind of an interesting one. Ms. Her, H-E-R, she was a Hmong person. This was in 1998. It was September of 1998 when a 911 call came in. First it was a hang-up. When they called back, it seemed that she wanted to be killed herself, okay, she wanted to. So they knew that, so they had to there, forced the door, didn't answer, opened the door, found her. There were 2 kids strangled on the main floor, 2 more in the basement, and 2 on the second level. The officer said it was one of the hardest things to see, okay? She said, when you're a police officer, you're supposed to be tough, she said, but I can't prepare for when you have 6 little kids dying. Now, Ms. Her said she had separated the children by getting them to play hide and seek with her. She said that when the children hid through the apartment, she went to each separate area, wrapped a strip of cloth around her necks, and strangled them. She said none of the children resisted. Then she tried to strangle herself with an electrical cord, but she was found semi-conscious. It's also interesting because when she was 12 years old, she was a Hmong refugee living in a refugee camp in Thailand. Her relatives married her to a 19-year-old man. Okay, she was 12. Okay, she said starting at age 13, almost every year she had a child, 6 in all. Okay, that's in a refugee camp, and she's got these kids one after another. It's got to be hard, right? And so it said when the murders happened, it was really, in the Hmong community especially, they said it was before a lot of people knew about it. They said that there's so much because it's such a huge tragedy. They felt that killing showed the importance to serve refugees scared by the drama of war, resettlement camps, making their own way in a new land. And she said that Ms. Her said she felt alone in her marriage and powerless. They said that the court and police records show there were 2 orders of protection against her husband. He pushed her, threatened to kill her or commit suicide, and blamed her. They said she don't think that she was evil kind of thing. She just decided to commit suicide because she did not want to leave her children without being properly cared for. She strangled the children to put them in heaven because she believed as a Christian that they were going to go straight to heaven. And in her mind, the thought of putting them in heaven would be a responsible thing to do, a loving thing to do as a mother. She needed help, right? She pleaded guilty. She had been serving 50 years here in Shakopee. She's still there. In Maplewood, the 6 children were buried. 11 years older, tombstones were actually added. They said it was so hard for the father, they never were able to buy it. So then finally when they did it, they said, the father said the tombstones were the most valuable things in his life. It's also interesting because when this was going on, and we're gonna have this ceremony, they wanted to have the mother related or in the ceremony somehow, even though she's in prison. So they asked her to write a statement which they would tell the people at the burial ground. So she said, "I love you. Thank you for giving me a chance to be a mother. It has been a great gift to share the experience with you. Thank you for being a blessing to me. You are my strength, my hope, and motivation. You are my everything and all that I have and treasure. I'm truly sorry that you paid the price in which you didn't deserve." And the cemetery superintendent said they would be marked forever and it will never be forgotten. And so they put 66 white roses there to mark this 11 years since the 6 deaths. And then the bell tolled 6 times, one for each child. What an interesting experience. Makes me want to kind of go and visit her. I want to see what she's like. All right. Another couple, last couple things that we have here. Nobody wants to be forgotten. This was in 2014. At the cemetery, the Catholic cemetery on 10th Street, there are 4 markers, and they just had numbers on them. And people were like, what are these numbers? What is this? Well, it turns out that they identified that there were 2 inmates and 2 infant children of the offenders from the old state reformatory for women in Shakopee. 3 of the deceased died in the 1920s. The 4th died in 1954. So the graves were the only marked by the numbers, just a number. That's how they knew that. So they got these people in the prison who were inmates, decided to raise money to have tombstones for those 4 graves. So they raised funds for 4 proper headstones. They had free will offerings, and eventually there was a group that's called the Challenge Inmate Program, and each of them helped. And then they actually, in 2014, they placed the headstones there. So if you go to Shakopee in the cemetery, go all the way to the right, and then halfway down you'll find the actual thing. And there's the tombstones there now. You can go there and see them now. They said, today we acknowledge 4 almost forgotten souls. Their lives clearly was not living to the great potential. Their dreams and aspirations probably unfulfilled. But they did walk the face of this earth, breathe this air as we do now, so many years later. They did most likely put a smile on a mother's face and had some moments of joy and happiness. So it's just kind of interesting about them. And we actually have been doing research on those, 4 of them too, so we don't have that on here, but it's just interesting about them. Another thing to remember is, of course, the fence. Remember, people would, every time in Shakopee there would be news in the newspaper about a woman escaped, a person with a knife entered a residence, threatened 2 children. They were fine actually, and they were returned in 25 minutes. But the Shakopee City Council requested a fence. At that same time, if you think about reformatory itself, and when I remember it, it was, there was no fence around the place. And it was kind of just like a college, kind of, if you want to think about it, although they couldn't leave, but it's kind of thing. But eventually, because it was more and more inmates who were there, it became too crowded. And say someplace, there was about 9 or 10 escapes happening a year, okay? And so again, they asked for a fence, and they wanted it with barbed wire, okay? And of course, the biggest thing was, it was right across from Sweeney School, okay? So that was part of the concern. And there, you actually go, there's some of the comedians who did shows in the evening, they would actually have stories about this, about the thing. Because it was kind of funny when you think about it, about this was the fence, basically, it was just this row of bushes there. Okay. So it was finally completed in 2016. It was just being built. There's a school across the street there. They finally got the legislator to give the money for that. The 12-foot fences. They said even though they had no fence for a while, only 8 prisoners had ever been escaped, but they were all later caught. Okay, so here it is with the location, and this would be 10th Avenue. So 6th Street was one side, 10th Avenue on the other side. This is while they're building that. And of course, in 1986, they were moved from the old reformatory to the new ones. There it is, now with the fence there. There's no barbed wire, but it's still a little bit there. Again, there's 569 inmates, okay? There are 10 buildings. They have a lot of programs, a lot of cognitive behavioral interventions, and they have things about that. Here's a look of where this would be. So this is 10th Avenue West, 10th Avenue West. So it's Sweeney School would be right here, and the Catholic Cemetery would be right there in terms of location. In case you should write this down in case you need to know how to escape. They have a lot of different programs, and they have some opportunities for them to get jobs here also. And again, it's interesting because there are articles and they show the people and they show their faces too, which is just kind of interesting. Sometimes they may keep working at the maintenance or food service, others. I still wish they still had the farm, because I feel that was such a good thing to have. Then of course in 2020, COVID. You know that's gotta be great. This person, there was an article in the paper that said Kelly was working there. She said you woke up breakfast at 7, she worked out, played cards, talked with others, then they watch TV, drinking coffee, walk outside, usually in circles. Then it's lunch, work, dinner, return to your cell. And they repeat this every day. Oops. And then COVID happened. She said it was even longer each day. The gym was closed, they could go outside just 1 hour a day, and she was limited to 1.5 hours in the day room. And she spent most of the time just infecting tables, chairs, railing, phones, door handles. It must not be very fun. At that time, a lot of people who had respiratory problems and stuff, they moved to a special place in the campus. They moved there because they thought that would help. Okay. And I know Kelly said at one point, she said, I know that if I contact the virus and give it to my roommate, she'd die. I don't want that on my conscience, and I don't want to deal with that. I'm like, yeah, but did you kill someone before that? No, I don't know, because I don't know anything about her, so I consider it. All right. Maureen is an interesting person. She actually ended up becoming a law degree while she was in prison. She was born in 1985 in Chicago to Nigerian parents. At one point, she was caught in a fire. She had to learn how to walk after she was caught in a fire at age 10. But that charge changed when in 2014, she was in a first-degree premeditated murder in a drug-related shooting in Minneapolis. She'd only been in Minneapolis for 8 months. She came here from Illinois. Her ex-boyfriend was selling drugs. She said it was like a double life. And eventually, he controlled her life. It was a very abusive and violent relationship. So she had been in a reformatory, and then at one point they found the person who was a heroin dealer was the one who killed Anthony. She was actually the person driving the car while they went in and killed him. And because of that, she was part of it, and therefore she was in jail. They said David Johnson will be allowed to release in 2040, but Maureen was sentenced to life without parole. That's not fair. All right. So she spent a long time working, mentoring, gardening, doing things. She ended up becoming a paralegal and prepared to enter law school. She said, God has a reason why he did everything. If I have to stay here forever, I'll stay here. But now I had such a pride that I didn't have what I got here. So eventually she learned that she could join the law school here in Minnesota. And she became the first national person who accepted a law school educating an incarcerated student. Oops. And they said, and the thing, because the article about it said, she said, she don't know if she'll ever use that when she's actually able to get out. She may just be stuck in prison for the rest of her life. But she said it's just the fact that she was able to do that. And of course they did, that thing was on video, right? So that's how she did her law degree, which is just kind of interesting. And then she passed the exam, which I just think is kind of interesting. And then finally, the last one we have here is Holly, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. She was Native American. They said when she was wanted, there's a thing online, when I first looked up about this, she was under the suspension for fleeing the police, giving false information, and probably drug charge. She was given 30 months in prison, okay? And she was here in Shakopee at the prison. And in the prison here, they had a special group, grief support group for women. And so because she was a Native American from North Dakota, she joined the group when she was placed here. The group had several members sorry, I don't know how I didn't spell that right, but anyway, she was people who were addicted and they had lost their parental rights. Others had given birth while they were incarcerated and had to give up their children. And so the support group was the first time that they'd ever done this in a prison. Gives an opportunity for them. They wrote in journals, they did a lot of activities, trying to cope with skills that they need to stay out of jail in the future. And there's a picture of her with her child, her son, that was taken too, so she never actually has ever seen her. They said in Minnesota, 77% of incarcerated women in Minnesota, the women here, were parents. The national average among all women is 62%. So it's huge, that's interesting. They help work through the trauma like childhood, physical, sexual abuse, being trafficked, victims of domestic violence, and that would usually cause them some kind of health problem. And really what it's doing is helping them manage the emotions that they had about losing their parent rights. And they are the group, there's the 9 of them, that all end up going at this. And it was really a big thing for them to actually do this. And eventually we know that she ended up getting granted parole. She's out now. And that was in 2022. So again, that's a little bit about this. There's 2 books that are out there. They're not in print anymore. One is For the Good of the Woman, a short history of Minnesota Correctional Facility. And the other one is a book about still inmates from Stillwater and Shakopee prison. It's like their poems and things like that. So they're just interesting things that I had looked at also. And of course, like I said, all of these people are eventually all be on the list of those 400 that are on the brochures. You can find more information about that. Here's some of them here, for example. And of course, the Shakopee Heritage Society, which I'm president of it, and it's our history, your history, Shakopee's history. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
I have a good story about the prison.
Yeah.
This was in the late 80s, and one of the field reps for the company I worked for was being transferred to Minnesota from Texas and wanted to live in a small town. And he knew that I was from this area, so he asked me to give him a tour of Shakopee. So we were on the west end, and we're driving by Sweeney, and I said, if you live on the west end of town, this is where your kids would go to school. And he goes, but what's that building across the street? And I said, oh, it's just a women's prison, it's no biggie. He goes, what? You don't want your kids to go to school across the street? I said, it's not a problem. You don't have to, it's been here for 100 years, you don't have to worry about it. So I calmed him down, and we keep driving over to, I think it was called Pearson's. I said, and if you live in the middle part of town, your kids go to school here, and then I started to laugh. And he goes, what's wrong? I said, the county jail is across the street. He moved to Burnsville.
Moved to where?
Burnsville.
Believe me, it's lost worse there. I'm just telling you.
So, in one of my first jobs, I was a news reporter. So I sat through a lot of city council meetings and planning meetings, and I can imagine if you're building an elementary school across the street from a prison, there'd be a lot of people from the community saying, is this a good idea? So I've always wanted, and I'm a newcomer to Shakopee, I've lived for about 10 years. I've always wondered how did this happen?
It is really interesting because obviously they had this area mapped out. It used to be part of the prison, and once they had it was available for Shakopee residents and the Scott County. So they had this land. Of course, they had the cemetery there too. And right beyond the school there is the swimming pool there. That's very popular there. They just redone that. That's been 50 years it's been there. It's very popular. But I think what's interesting is that when they used to worry about the women's prison, they would ask the people who lived around them, who lived there, and they all said, no, they don't want a fence. It was fine.
Yeah, no, we didn't, we objected to the fence.
Yeah.
It was, so it's there, so what? Big
Yeah.
deal.
But it was partly, I think, because it was more a place of rehab kind of thing, and people were there enough. I think over time, it became from those superintendents to wardens. So the last couple have been wardens, and that's become a little switch a little bit more with the fence and all that kind of, it all fits that part more than before. Then it was really just, they'd actually have, when it first started, the superintendent used to, group of them would go walking down to the river there and go around, and just come back, it's not a big deal. So I think that's kind of the big thing, and I think that it was not really much of a concern when it was a smaller town still,
Right.
you know, up to 10,000 people there maybe. Once it went beyond that, now it's like 50,000, right? That started to make it was a little worried, and then I think it became, when you realize that at one point, this is the end of town,
Right.
now it's gone way beyond that, so it's like, you know, so it is an interesting thing. But you know, I think about that, I don't think there was much of a complaint with the people there about having a school there.
It was.
What I remember, I don't think it was a big.
So it was more of a rehabilitation facility when the
Is
school was
what,
built.
yeah.
And it sounded like Girl Scouts would go there and.
Oh, all the time, yeah, like I said, we walked by and they were playing softball and they'd say, you wanna play with us? Cause they needed some, really, to go play, you know?
Yeah.
We're really worried, we all think, ooh, we'd say things, you know, like, because we were kids, you know, it's like, oh my God, you're gonna, kill us or whatever, but nothing like that happened. Mostly because the people who were really bad ones probably weren't allowed outside probably to start with.
Interesting.
And your father, your father, was involved there too?
Yeah, he worked there for many years until he retired, and the same as the other gentleman who worked there, he did the same work, he had a boiler's license, and, you know, they weren't called guards, they did maintenance, and at the same time, they were guards, you know,
I think he's the one person said, one person was on duty, and that was it, and then eventually it was two people on duty.
Right, and, you know, I know a couple times they came home, and it sure was rough to keep home because they had an issue where they had to hold the women down, you know, for one reason or another, but, yeah, a lot of those stories that you told, I heard firsthand from him.
Yeah, I'll contact him later because he has some good stories and I think it's good to add on more in terms of what the people were. Because the people in town, it was not a big thing. In fact, they were thrilled that they got the prison. That was a big thing at that time. So I suppose because it was a job thing for a lot of people.
It was rather unique correctional facility in Minnesota with the simple reason, like you say,
Yeah.
not only that, but I guess I want to say things are a little more humane, so to speak.
Yeah.
There, how should I say, a little controversy, even the patch, MCIW, oh boy, Minnesota Correctional Facility for Women. Every other correctional facility was MCF specifically.
Yeah.
Yet even juvenile facilities, state operated.
Yeah.
They all, you mentioned that you were from Shakopee, when you were in these facilities, they look at you,
Yeah.
you know. And of course, I went through 6 sheriffs here,
Yeah.
and like I said, I did a lot of the writs, meeting the prisoners, and of course, that made for interesting conversations.
Do you have any questions?
I was just gonna mention, one of the rehab opportunities for the women prisoners was volunteering in teams, maybe it was a privilege for them, to volunteer at Loaves and Fishes.
Yeah.
And, you know, we'd be there serving dinner and that was dinners.
Yeah.
And a team of them would come in their brown uniforms, if I remember right. And, you know, just, it was wonderful that they could be there and be out of the prison serving.
Yeah.
Do they get to do that anymore?
Pardon?
What's it?
Do they get to do that anymore?
We are no longer serving Loaves and Fishes here, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But
But they do have some things still on
I
job.
think I saw some of the inmates working at the food shop not that long
Yeah,
ago.
that's what I was saying.
right.
That was
Because I was,
a trustee that
Yeah,
they came up
right,
with.
the academy.
Yeah, the academy. You drive by and you'd see them all out, you know, in their uniforms.
Yeah. that's the people who did the tombstones, kind of figure that out.
Right, you could see the brown from the knees on down
You
in
did,
the
right,
background.
because they had to in some way to identify in case they escaped, but for the most part, there were people who were already probably getting close to getting out themselves probably.
In the 80s also, we volunteered for, they were called Kairos weekends, and they were a spiritual weekend celebration in Christ. And a lot of the prisoners participated in that.
I mean, I would think partly is if you're in the prison, you want to get out and do something. Or who, you know, when you have things together, otherwise you're just bored, you know, so it's nice to have something to do, so I think that probably helps. Okay, well, thank you again. Oh, so I have this, so, today, what is the date today?
29.
Okay, May. Is anyone have a birthday today? In the next month?
Last week.
Last week? That's sure, I said, I said, after, so. But anyway, thank you so much. Please,